Today we have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. David Bissell from the University of Melbourne. The title of the talk is Losing Investments in Mobility Transitions, Reckoning with Loss in the Wake of On-Demand. I will say a few words about David, even though I suspect that if you're interested in transport and mobilities, you already know David's work. So David is Associate Professor and Australian Research Council Future Fellow in the School of Geography at the University of Melbourne. David has published widely on a range of different aspects of mobile lives, from commuting, public transport atmospheres, stillness, to habit, to mobility futures. And in 2018, David published the book Transit Life, which many already consider to be an essential text across mobility studies, transport studies, human geography. So once again, David, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. The presentation is going to last for about half of today's 1 hour session. This should give us plenty of time for a discussion afterwards. And throughout the session, you can put questions in the chat, and I will do my best to pick them up afterwards during the discussion. Also, once the presentation is finished, you're very welcome to raise your virtual hand and to introduce your question or comment yourself. So I think this is all in terms of logistics. And David, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna, for that lovely introduction and for the very kind invitation to present today. I'm just going to get my slides up. So I think this should work. Okay, great. And also thank you so much to Hannah and Kirsty for your help in setting the seminar up too. That's really good of you. Before I begin, as it's important to do here in Australia, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what I'd like to talk about today comes from a project that has consumed, I guess, much of the past few years for me, which has been looking at on-demand mobility, so the rise of Uber, Deliveroo, and the like, from a consumption, production, and governance perspective. So what I'm presenting on today, I guess, is more that kind of third leg, the governance side of things, but with a bit of a twist. So my starting point is that geographers, mobility scholars, and transport researchers are, as you all well know, playing a really important role in enhancing our understanding of mobility transitions. Now, cultural geographers of mobility in particular have stressed how a fixation on the productive role of technology obscures important considerations of embodiment, difference, and politics. Now, building on this work, my contention is that productivist accounts of technological change fail to acknowledge the critical politics of who loses out in mobility transitions and how these losses are distributed, sustained, and reckoned with. So, as the title suggests, this is a paper all about how loss is reckoned with in the wake of technological change. And I think this is important because neglecting loss risks imagining mobility transitions as a simple toggling of one mode of operation to another without casualty, leaving insufficient space to consider the gaps, breaks, and tears in experience. So the particular scene of loss in this paper that I'm going to present today involves on-demand rideshare mobility, which of course has proliferated in cities around the world. Now, whilst critical political economy scholarship has pointed to the multiple forms of financial loss occurring in the wake of these new technologies, my contention is that these accounts need to be supplemented by attention to the micro-political embodied dimensions of loss, and more on that later. So in response, this paper develops a cultural geographic sensitivity to how bodies themselves are being changed in the wake of rideshare. And to do so, it focuses on overlooked experiences of loss in taxi mobilities, which have been significantly disrupted by on-demand rideshare platforms. Specifically, this paper explores experiences of people who invested in taxis and who have subsequently lost significant amounts of money. And this is something that's happened in many cities around the world, and there's been extensive column inches devoted to it in the press. Now, this group of taxi investors, I think, raises some really interesting questions about how financial investments relate to what I will outline in a moment as affective investments in terms of how losses are reckoned with give rise to particular collective experiences, and modulate the conditions for politics. So that's the kind of broad, lofty summary, but the paper has two real aims. And the first of those aims is I guess, substantive, and it's to broaden appreciation of underdocumented forms of loss that on-demand rideshare platforms are having on urban life, and to explore the overlooked experiences of individuals who are invested in these taxi worlds. And the second aim, I guess kind of the more conceptual aim maybe, is to explore how a loss of investment is reckoned with as both a financial and an existential challenge, and to evaluate how such experiences might tell us something significant as geographers, as mobility scholars and transport scholars about the nature of investments. Okay, so to begin, I guess I want to start by acknowledging how geographers have actually done a lot to expand our understanding of what constitutes the economy. So a focus on embodiment in particular in recent years has broadened the purview of economic analysis beyond the narrow operation of state structures and financial institutions to consider the everyday lives of finance across multiple sites, to reveal the intricate ways in which the economic, cultural, and material intersect and interact in specific settings, as Langley and Leishon say. Now, a major contribution of cultural geography to these economic debates has been to stress how the concept of investment, again, previously understood in a more narrow financial sense, must account for the affective forces that drive and sustain economic activities. Now, this focus requires a more transitional understanding of the bodies in question that evaluates them in terms of their indeterminate capacities to act and feel rather than their more determinate identities. So affect as an object of analysis can help appreciate how people become invested in particular economic activities in the first place through its role as a driving force in processes of accumulation, as Dan Cocaine suggests. Understanding what makes active investor subjects therefore requires accounting for, in Anson et al.'s words, the entanglements, fantasies, and desires that are involved in fueling economic activities. Now, Larry Grossberg's concept of affective investments, which is, I guess, where I kind of started thinking about these ideas, really encapsulates this sense of investment quite well, which has subsequently been developed by social thinkers who are interested in performativity. And I just want to briefly highlight three of the thinkers that have been most influential for me in trying to think about this issue. So firstly, Zellezer's work foregrounds how interpersonal relationships are a really fundamental but overlooked aspect of economic activity, where people, in her words, constantly mingle economic activity with intimacy. The second person I draw on a fair bit is Ahmed's work, and Sarah Ahmed develops this focus on relationships with others, but she draws out the temporal dimensions of affective investments and highlights how people become invested in, for example, particular normative ideals about conduct, and how these investments then become tested in time through encounters with others. Thirdly, Lauren Ballant's work extends this much more, I guess, kind of dynamic sense of affective investments even further by drawing out the ambivalent and contradictory effects of these investments. So where passionate attachments to promises can, over time, serve to damage and deplete. Now, in short, understanding financial subjectivities requires an understanding of the complex and contradictory affective investments that have real effects through the transitions in acting and feeling that they induce. So these more distributed understandings of agency that come from these three thinkers, for instance, highlight in McFall et al.'s work, the tricky, tenuous, and often polarizing elements of attachment. However, there's always a however. In the emerging body of work on affective investments, I think much less has been said about how affective investments are cut, severed, or lost. So where Ben Anderson and colleagues question how forms of living and their promises and trajectories are held onto, sustained, and reanimated in the wake of economic change, I think a focus on sustenance and reanimation focuses on the persistence of investments at the expense of their dissipation, their attenuation, omitting the gaps and breaks in experience. And for me, this absence raises some really fundamental questions about the forms of bodily evaluation that might be involved in divestment and the kinds of work that might be required. So developing a strand of cultural geographic thought that acknowledges that not all relations are relations of attachment. My argument is that constructivist understandings of investment, focusing on the development and maintenance of social worlds, needs pairing with an understanding about the loss of investment as both economic and affective. So what's really, really clear actually from cultural geography literature, such as Esther Hitchens' brilliant work on austerity, is that economic loss doesn't necessarily translate into a loss of affective investment in an idea or belief. So experiences of economic loss might paradoxically serve to intensify attachment to a specific investment, thereby demonstrating, in Laurent Ballant's terms, a relation of attachment to compromised conditions of possibility. Yet what is also emphasized by cultural geographers is that the reconfiguration of affective investments in the wake of poor economic circumstances can reveal itself through really surprising diverse responses. So Leila Dorney's and colleagues' work on the affective contours of indebtedness, for instance, shows that indebtedness can be lived through a really complex series of low-level affective states, such as dissociation and anxiety, rather than stress. And this works, doesn't stress this idea of persisting attachments to specific ideals at all. Furthermore, there might be investments that we might need to give up, especially if they're ultimately harmful. And yet this process is anything but simple. As Sarah Ahmed writes, our investments cannot simply be willed away. It takes time to move on and to move away. So the process of divesting affective investments has its own unpredictable terrain that in the process can recast bodily evaluations of that investment. So in this regard, Ahmed writes that giving up after a lifetime of investment can lead to anger, hatred, and despair, which become retrospective readings of the investment itself as the origin of injury. Indeed, this retrospective evaluation can, I think, tell us something key about the nature of the former attachment, since, as McFall and colleagues suggest, if the work of market attachment often goes unnoticed, it's paradoxically the processes of detachment that sometimes reveal the strength of the tie. So these literatures taken together indicate that loss, divestment, and giving up of affective investments is a really complex and unpredictable process that requires a sense of the geographical specificity of situations. So pairing what I've just said, the economic with the affective, what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is explore a situation where a loss of financial investment becomes reckoned with in different ways, prompting people to reevaluate their affective investments. Okay, so to change gears slightly. So the focus of for exploring loss in this paper involves investors in taxi mobilities in Melbourne, Australia, as I indicated at the start. Now, from a political economy perspective, though much has been said about how the rise of recent rideshare platforms shifts the burden of risk onto drivers who lack basic employment rights, historical accounts of changing taxi capitalism, in Tucker's words, over the course of the 20th century reveals, of course, a much, much longer history of exploitation in this space. Now, in Melbourne, taxis operated through what Tucker calls medallion capitalism until recently, which, for those of you who don't know, is a system that restricts the number of taxis in operation through the number of licenses available, but also enables license holders to profit from passive income. In metropolitan Melbourne, to give you an idea of numbers, 4,330 taxi licenses were regulated by the state government, and their scarcity, of course, inflated their price. Excuse me. In 2011, each license was worth $500,000 and generated an average annual passive income of $30,000 per license for holders. However, in a 2011 state government inquiry stressed that there was no strong public interest grounds for continuing to restrict entry to the taxi market, again, as in many cities. A year later, in 2012, Uber launched in Australia, offering significantly cheaper prices than taxis for riders, and all states, all jurisdictions in Australia, gradually overhauled their taxi regulations to accommodate rideshare vehicles. So here in Victoria in 2017, hire car registration became available for an annual fee of just $55.10, with numbers unrestricted, which meant that the value of former taxi and hire car licenses, previously $500,000, was effectively reduced to zero. As a result of this deregulation, the number of rideshare vehicles in Victoria grew 691% from 8,460 to 66,894. So of course that massive boost reflects the rise of rideshare vehicles. Now, in spite of demands by licence holders for adequate compensation for having their licences revoked, the state government here in Victoria was not obliged to pay compensation and instead paid ex gratia transition payments to 4,139 licence holders of just $100,000 per licence for the first licence and $50,000 per licence for 3 subsequent licences. A 2019 inquiry into these reforms acknowledges that many investors have substantial debts and have lost what they considered to be their self-funded retirement scheme, resulting in significant emotional distress. So this paper draws from fieldwork that I did in Melbourne with 8 taxi investors who are struggling with significant levels of personal debt in the wake of on-demand mobility. I can talk a little bit more about methods in the questions if that's of interest, but after an initial interview with one of the taxi group's representatives, I was put in touch with a number of other investors who were really keen to share their stories of loss with me. Of the 8 investors I talked to, I've selected 3 interview encounters to draw out here, partly because of the diversity of situations I think they show, but also partly because they were highly affecting encounters. So I want to now just present 3 impressionistic portraits that I think hopefully draw out something of the contextual complexity of each encounter. So story 1 is Selina. Selina paces around the room, gesticulating fiercely, and her friend and I sit at the dining room table. Selina's husband drives a taxi. He bought a license 30 years ago, then another 2 licenses to fund their retirement, generating $90,000 a year in income. "You don't understand how angry we are," she shouts. Conversation is dominated by how the government have set out to destroy the industry. She says, "None of us were politically active before this. We held a rally. We stormed Parliament." But she says, "They were telling us we're selfish, greedy license owners. The media was never going to be on our side, but we were paying for our own retirement. How would you feel if you lost everything you worked for? There's no faith in our government." She says, "We don't exist, but I've done nothing wrong. Where's the justice for us?" Selina says, "We've been fighting for 8 years. It's destroyed us. We're mentally and physically drained. People have committed suicide." Her friend describes having to work long hours and going to a food bank, which her husband doesn't know about. Selina says, "We're both embarrassed. I had envisaged a life where I could take my granddaughter out for a cupcake, but I can't do it." Her friend says, "I think I've lost the plot. I don't know what's happened to me. I want to go to jail." She fantasizes, "I think I'm a nasty woman now, but see, this is not who we were. We've just become such bitches." Selina says most of the men are still in denial. They won't accept it. She says, "We've resigned ourselves," but she corrects herself, stating emphatically, "No, I'm sorry, no, we're not giving up. We went through years of depression, so how do you let go?" Her friend says, "My kids actually said, 'Mum, get over it, it's time.' They knew we were hurting." Of her children, she said, "It used to make me want to forget, you know, they actually make me happy." But referring to their parents who migrated from Europe, Selina says, "It's not just about our money, it's about the dignity of our parents. I owe my mum and dad." After 4 hours of witnessing such pain, I leave feeling shaken and uncomfortable, and my head is spinning. These women have confided in me. "We need someone to stand up for us," they told me. I'm unsure about how I can measure up to this. Second story is Brad. Brad slumps in his seat and he looks exhausted. We're in a small warehouse office on the outskirts of the city and wind gusts under the door. Brad drives a taxi and owned 3 licenses. He says, "No one would have ever thought that any government would cancel a legitimate asset. Uber have just forced their way in," he says. "The government has been paid off massively. They think we're a bunch of illegitimate drivers. They've struck deals with shopping centres to ambush people. After the government cancelled his assets, the bank took his house, sold it, leaving him almost $500,000 in debt. He, his wife and 2 small children moved into this room for 18 months. Brad works 80 to 100 hours a week. You've got to work that time to get even half of what you used to get. He says, "I've got to be happy all the time for the customers. My younger customers, I take them through McDonald's. I'm buying the customers." He says, "We've got to create our own work." His driver colleagues have put together WhatsApp groups to share jobs. We try and hold each other up, but people are still desperate. For Brad, holidays are gone. I never see my kid. My relationship has collapsed. My wife has nothing to do with me. It's my fault. I failed. He says, when I get home, I feel angry, so angry. Sometimes I sleep in the factory because I still get overwhelmed. He says, I hate playing the victim, but I still just don't know which way to go. He says, I can't quit everything because I need the money to pay for now. So I'm enslaved to the cab. He started selling finance as a side hustle, but he can't invest more time in this since bankruptcy would take away this option from him. He's always second guessing himself. As for the ongoing court cases, he admits there are times that he has to step away because he says, I can't physically do this. I offer Brad a fare to the train station. He's going that way to play guitar at an open mic night. We pause at traffic lights and he passes me a YouTube video of him to watch. After our conversation, this country and western ballad feels more melancholic. It just helps me unwind, he says. And the third story is Mary's. Mary is a picture of calm. There's an elegance to how she moves her hands, which mirrors her measured, deliberate expression. Mary's late husband drove taxis and owned 6 licenses. My aim was to keep them and pass them on, she says. She used the funds to support disadvantaged children. That was my way of paying back for a good run. It's just soul destroying for me. I've let him down. She says, I want payment for something I own. For a government to just snap them off you, can't get my head around that. I don't know where we'll go with all this. I did see optimism, Mary says, but I also think there's such a thing as false hope. She speaks of others who have been affected. Of one, she says, I dread the day when she has no hope. For others, she says, all anger, it'll destroy them. She pauses. My biggest concern is some of the ones that ring up because they're panicking. Am I giving them false hope? I do sometimes get off the phone feeling guilty because I find myself now saying, I don't know. She says, you just feel so useless. Do I feel that way myself, she asks rhetorically. No, not now, she concedes. I'm just not a person that gets angry. I'm disappointed that I can't do what I wanted to do in these twilight years. She tells me about the amount of money spent on court cases and turns away from me briefly, as if lost in thought. If I was brutally honest, I think it's done and dusted. You know, I've come to terms with all that mire. My biggest heartache is the feeling that I've let my husband down. She asked me, so if you were in our position, what would you do? Troubled, I stay for a while. I feel touched witnessing her reflections on life and what she's learned. Most of all, she says, we really don't have much control over anything we do. So as you can imagine, these 3 encounters were profoundly affecting. Yet, whilst all 3 people are affected by similar events of dispossession, their narratives reach for different explanations and rationale. And what I want to do in this little part of the paper is to develop 2 main arguments that I'll outline now. So the first of those is that considering the collective dimension of these stories, I want to explain that there are 3 ways that these narratives collectively evidence a loss of affective investment. And the second part of the argument, and here considering the differential force of these narratives, I argue that these people, differently consumed by their circumstances, are reckoning with this loss in different ways. So in this regard, while these stories respond to and evidence the various lost investments of these people, as I'll suggest, in their articulation, their differential expression also serve to subtly reorient these losses in different ways. As Reid argues, narratives and stories structure the orientation of desire, providing scenarios through which we understand existence while simultaneously being structured by desire. It's the way to do things, basically. The first lost investment that I think these narratives collectively express relates to forms of institutional abandonment. So take Selina's narrative that emphasizes government corruption, recounting stories about how Uber had been schmoozing the government, while Brad's narrative similarly emphasizes how the government has been paid off massively. He also highlights the diminution of taxi investors in the eyes of the government. Though Mary's narrative also incorporates corruption, this accusation is combined with incredulity that a government could just snap off something she owned. So palpable for me here were affects of anger, cynicism, and disbelief. Rather than being connective, I suggest that these affects have given rise to a loss of faith in the institutions that had previously been enabling in their lives. And this loss of faith becomes a catalyst for action. As Selina says, none of us were politically active before this. The second loss of investment that these narratives, I think, collectively express relates to public abandonment. So again, witness Selina's description of accusations of selfishness that have been leveled against them as greedy license owners. Brad alludes to humiliation felt through the increased demands from his younger riders. And Mary articulates this disconnect in terms of her unfulfilled desire to be respected and understood. So palpable for me were affects here of shame from being ostracized from publics that were previously tacitly supportive of their cause. And again, as such, rather than being connective, these affects suggest a situation of retreating publics who are not invested in their loss. And this loss of face catalyzes activities to reconcile such ostracization, such as reaching out to others, as well as drawing on narratives that remove the disgust of self-entitlement. The third affect of investment that I think these narratives collectively allude to relates to the abandonment of vitality. So Selina's narrative expresses a depleted sense of vitality through feeling mentally and physically drained, and a sense of being suspended in the present. Brad's narrative, punctured by a relationship breakdown, testifies to a similar sense of overwhelm and an inability to invest in alternative futures. Mary narrates suspension somewhat differently through her expressions of feeling useless to others. So palpable for me in each of these narratives, I think, were affects of hopelessness and confusion about what to do. And again, rather than being connective, these affects seem to have given rise to a loss of conviction in a future, unsure about how to proceed. However, in spite of these experiences, what I think is really striking about how each of these is how each of these people remain invested in their loss in different ways. So witness, for instance, how the dramatic felt intensities of anger indicate how these experiences of loss continues to consume Selina and Brad especially. And crucially, there is an acknowledgement that this attachment is also devastating them. So here I suggest that part of the work of reconciling with lost investments for these three people involves the passivity of giving way. So in spite of the symbolic and material obligations that sustain attachments to their loss, each person, as you can sense, hopefully, admits the value of detaching from this loss. So Mary, for me, is perhaps least tentative when she says, if I was to be totally and brutally honest, I think it's been done and dusted. So here, palpable is her transition in feeling as her anger has waned, ceding to disappointment. Brad describes times he knows he must step away because he can't physically do this, indicating a bodily state of being pushed to a threshold of bearability. Selina describes how her children see how much hurt this loss is causing them, telling her to get over it. And at one point, even Selina admits that we've resigned ourselves. Now, where the previous investment, in argument number one, I guess, emphasized the various activities or active affections that loss has given rise to, here what I'm arguing is that reckoning with loss also involves working on passive affections or capacities to be affected and to feel. Now, cultural geographers have long emphasized how new modes of receptivity are formed through all kinds of passively affecting forces of our environments. And recently, Jane Bennett, for instance, highlights the political significance of appreciating how bodily sensibilities are formed through precisely being impressed upon by outside agencies. Yet while affirming the porosity of subjects' openness, as Bennett and of course many others do, Bennett's got much less to say about how people evaluate and filter damaging forms of non-recuperable influence. Discernible from these three people's narrations are the depleting dimensions of being consumed by their situations of loss. So, put simply, a capacity to be affected by situations that continue to cause them pain. So here, the challenge seems to be much less about enhancing receptivity, but about reducing their capacity to be affected by loss that continues to have a hold over them. Yet, as Stephen Connor describes, such passivity is not just giving in. He says such passivity is neither the opposite of power nor its simple abdication, but rather its necessary modulation, its necessary change. So, though Bennett says little about how we filter damaging influences, as I've suggested, her preoccupation in this book with affirming our sensitivities to influence in our environments, our enlivening passive affections, I think seems an important part, actually, of how these three people attempt to reconcile their lost investments. So striking about my encounter with all three people was how, in spite of continuing to be affected by loss, other more enlivening experiences of being affected were still discernible. So Selina's friend, for instance, talks about her children in warmth in the present tense, that, you know, they actually make me happy. Brad's relaxed demeanor in the taxi ride, showing me his YouTube video, albeit simple, contrasted from his resigned posture in the warehouse room. For Mary, I felt a real sense of uplift during our conversation after the formal interview that opened out onto love and life. So part of reconciling lost investments here is about remaining susceptible to other passive affections, other influences, if you like. Now, Matthew Hanna's argument that what consumes our attention has a directional specificity is, I think, quite useful here. So he argues that in turning our attention towards something, and this sounds kind of obvious, we simultaneously turn away from other things. That makes sense. So though we're fundamentally exposed to all manner of influences, he says we need to differentiate between those appeals we don't control, to which we want to be open and available, and those to which we don't want to be available. Now, although I find his argument really compelling, and it emphasizes really nicely the ethical significance of evaluating between enabling and constraining passive affections, this actually, and maybe a bit more problematically, also presumes that people have a really strong capacity to make this decision and to not return to a constraining influence. Yet, this is obviously not what's happening to these people. For Selina's friend, though she says of her children, "It used to make me want to forget," it's the memory of her parents that returns her back to her loss. Similarly, though Mary admits that she has come to terms with all that mire, she returns to the scene of loss out of loyalty to her friends. So in short, and I guess in sum, this process of reconciling with lost investments is difficult because it's a much more fraught process than a simple turning away from them. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, geography especially has always been really interested in questions of investment in terms of what's meaningful for people. But as Mitch Rose suggests quite recently, such concerns have been less prominent over the past 2 decades, as cultural geographers especially have become much more preoccupied with exploring bodily competencies than questions of what becomes meaningful and why. Now, responding to this charge, what I try to do in this paper is build on debates on affective investments to argue that financial and affective investments are inextricably linked. However, in contrast to work that's considered how investments endure, sustain, this paper has considered how investments, both in the financial and affective sense, can be lost, to explore how these lost investments become reckoned with. So, more substantively, what I've tried to do in this paper is focus on taxi investors as a small but I think quite significant overlooked population who are having to deal with the loss of their financial investments in the wake of the ascendancy of rideshare platforms. So these stories of divestment, I think, pose some really intriguing questions for geographers, mobility scholars, and transport researchers in terms of how we should respond to these losses, and I guess kind of more broadly, which losses we should respond to. Certainly there were times that I felt really uncomfortable about doing this research, not least because I felt that my presence was offering the false hope that troubled Mary. Yeah, and maybe perhaps more significantly, these taxi investors spotlight a vexed moral economy of loss at the heart of this argument that's reminiscent of Judith Butler's discussion of how certain lives are framed as more or less grievable than others. As these 3 people themselves imply, part of their vulnerability is because their loss is not framed as grievable by others. So a difficulty for us too might be how the political economy of their subject position as essentially financial investors renders them as beneficiaries of the passive income of rentier capitalist opportunities that geographers have long critiqued. Though the rise of rideshare platforms mean that the beneficiary of rentier capitalist relations has just been displaced, arguably, to Silicon Valley startups, for critical geographers who flag the ethical imperative of wealth redistribution, if these losses were the result of the dismantling of rentier capitalist exchange, they could represent precisely the kinds of justice that such scholars are calling for. Yet the losses described in this paper are far from a dispassionate corporate casualty. They are pretty intimate wounds that bear witness to vulnerabilities that I think demand our critical attention. So in focusing on the experiences of 3 people who had invested in taxi licenses in Melbourne to explore reflections on life in the wake of rideshare, what I think becomes apparent is how a loss of financial investment in the licenses precipitates a change in their sense of self through a loss of affective investments. And these lost affective investments are expressed in terms of a loss of faith in government and institutions that were previously viewed as enabling in their lives, a loss of faith in terms of the respect from the public, and a loss of conviction in terms of an inability to move forward with their lives. So in short, rather than a strengthening and a development of affective investments, we witnessed 3 people trying to make sense of their situation where the supports that are provided by institutions, by publics, and by a sense of onward motion seem to fall away, leaving them exposed and vulnerable to the outside. These are three people who feel abandoned in the wake of rideshare, and this abandonment was expressed through during the interview encounter through a range of affects, through anger, shame, and confusion, and it certainly wasn't restricted to these three people. Appreciating these situations of abandonment, especially a loss of investment in state institutions, matters in part because they help us to understand the conditions that can potentially give rise to new allegiances. Now, one response to such vulnerability is, as I've suggested, the activity of working on one's active affections. As these encounters with taxi investors suggest, such outward-facing activities are multiple, spanning protests, from protests to creating communities of support. However, and crucially, I've also argued that reconciling with loss also involves working on one's passive affections, so one's capacity to be affected, to feel. What I've sought to emphasize is how divestment is difficult and without guarantee. There isn't a solution to just choosing to feel these losses differently. As each of these encounters indicate, these three people remain invested, albeit in different ways, in their situation of loss that remain differently obdurate. So yielding and turning away are two ways that these people attempt to work on their passive affections, to divest these losses. Yet the damaging influence of these losses are difficult to filter, influences that cannot be easily turned away from. So it's these different extents revealed through the three different narratives that indicates that there's also a politics to this divestment. Perhaps most notably, considering the more precarious economic situation that Selina and Brad are in relative to Mary, there is a politics in who can afford to divest, to turn away. And relatedly, as Brad's reflections on his thresholds of bodily bearability suggest, there's also a temporal politics at play in terms of when one must turn away. So ultimately, where Larry Grossberg in 1992 argues that affective investments are empowering, I want to close by speculating that in some situations, such as the experiences of irredeemable financial loss explored in this paper, relinquishing depleting affective investments through giving way might be a necessary but overlooked dimension of empowerment, creating new capacities to feel differently, and maybe even to finally move on. Thanks.